What does artificial intelligence mean for our work, for our lives, and for the entire world? These are questions that our guest today, Peter Scott, has considered in depth in the numerous episodes of his podcast, Artificial Intelligence and You, 109 episodes at the last count, I think, and also in his hot off-the-press book of the same name. Peter has a fascinating and varied background that includes a master's degree in computer science from Cambridge University, more than 30 years working for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, helping to advance the exploration of space, and a parallel career in the human development field as a certified coach, addressing technological disruption. In a way, questions about artificial intelligence can be split into two. First, what does artificial intelligence mean for our work, for our lives, and for the entire world? And second, for those of us who believe the answers to the first set of questions are profound and likely involve radical change, how can we best introduce these topics to the general public? In other words, how can we communicate with general audiences about the promise and peril of AI in a way that we observe the most important leverage points, avoid the worst misunderstandings, take account of fascinations, and what are the missed opportunities, moreover? Peter, welcome to London Futurists. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David, for that kind and generous introduction. Thank you all for attending, especially at a time when you could be getting right down to the pub, get an early start. So thank you all for that. I'm going to put some slides on here now. There we go. And why not start with a quote from a British author? And yes, even Kipling had something to say about machines. A little dramatic, but wasn't he just? So here I am talking to futurists, and most of my message in talking to other people is you need to think about the future more or at all. And you're already doing that. So we've got to do something different. And I love a challenge. So you're already focused on the future, which means you are not like everyone else, which is vacuously true. Otherwise, London Futurists would have 1 million members. And to us, we wake up every day wishing, please do not be like yesterday. We do not want more of the same. Be different. Sometimes we need to be more specific about that because we have had 2 years of different and not the sort of future that we had in mind, right? But we are not just comfortable with disruption, we look forward to it. And technologists in Silicon Valley, these are our brothers and sisters in disruption. It's their job description to cause disruption. And if they are not making mistakes, then they know they're not moving fast enough because their ethos is move fast and break things, right? Now, and how many of you are science fiction fans, right? I rest my case. And by the way, where is my flying car? I have been waiting 50 years. I am losing patience. It is overdue. Just putting that out there. So this talk is not my usual fare, which is designed to impress upon people the need for thinking about the future, to be conscious about it, to curate their experience with the future more deliberately, but to take more of a third viewpoint, looking at the experience of delivering that message to bring back experience, learnings, lessons from doing that with those audiences to help inform you what's the experience of doing that with audiences, like some of the things that have been instructive in that. Since everyone else is talking about it these days, and I've gotten a lot of mileage out of the last few podcasts, let's consider how the Blake Lemoine episode, imagine we're all familiar with this guy who works for Google, declared that their Lambda AI had become sentient, and is getting a lot of press because of that. And of course, everyone's asking me about that. And so what do we do with that? The first lesson here, the first observation is that the question, is this thing sentient, is the wrong question. It might be a favorite of the media, precisely for the same reason that it is the wrong question, which is that there's no way of answering it. No one has a way of telling whether something is sentient, to the best of my knowledge, in any way that is accessible, useful, understandable to other people, especially if that is done through a text chat. So, which makes it a great question for talk shows, because they know that the question is not going to be answered by anyone, and it will just remain a vigorous debate. So, and you know, some of the sort of questions that or conversation, so like an extract from that here, you can see now, it's certainly the sort of thing that someone inexperienced with the performance of transformers, which is not electrical or anime, but the term for a type of AI that most characterized by, for instance, GPT-3, is someone not experienced with the performance of devices like that would absolutely look at a conversation like this and think there is something going on between the ears of this electronic brain. And we have some better experience with that. The real, or perhaps some of the more productive questions are, look, we have been sentient as a species now for going on 1 million years, give or take. How come we don't yet know how to tell? You'd think that that was enough practice. And now it's actually becoming important that we do, right? This conversation has actually started earlier, not only earlier than I expected, but in actually the wrong direction from what I expected. Just goes to show that futurist or not, can't predict this sort of thing. And because I would run through a hypothetical scenario like this with audiences all the time as part of my continuing studies or extension classes. And I would, after having talked around the possibility of AI becoming conscious, self-aware, exercising free will, I would say, well, where do you think that would come from first? Where would you expect the news or the possibility that AI has evolved to this degree to come from? And the usual answers are Google, Apple, Facebook. And I say, yeah, but what about, and I say, the mouse. And because it's part of their job description at Disney to create believable characters, and usually ones that have some physical instantiation for the theme parks, of course. And here you see their progress in creating just such a thing. Disney is absolutely walking towards having characters that are robotic and can walk around the theme park and interact with the audience there. And of course, being Disney characters, you expect them to emote, to demonstrate in fact the characteristics of sentience. And how far might we be, I would say, from a time when a little girl comes home from the park and says, "Mommy, Daddy, we've got to do something about Olaf. He's trapped there. He wants to get out. He told me. I can feel it." And where that might become a question. because these people are working towards it fastest. So I use that as an example of saying, well, I don't think that your answer of Google is laudable, obvious, and probably wrong. And then guess who turned out to be wrong? So, and I do see a question here. So could it something be conscious but not sentient? That's a good question. I believe that, and I do have a slide about that later. So we'll look at that in some more depth then. But yes, they're not mutually exclusive. So that takes care of Blake Lemoine. And now, but what about the people we're talking to? What about the people who are not part of our glorious bubble of futurism and technology? And the answer is that about half of them, in survey after survey, do not trust AI or don't want it used to affect their lives or think that it should be under more control. They don't understand it. They know they don't understand it, and they don't like that they don't understand it. So they are, in a word, terrified. And it's not as simple as just being afraid of change or being afraid of the unknown. So most of us like to explore, right? Maybe take a trip to the Amazon or Africa or the Andes, go somewhere we have never been before. And I submit that the zest in that is encountering the unexpected. You may remember and fondly a lot of the things that occurred on that trip that you were expecting to see, but I'll bet you remember even more fondly the things that surprised you, right? So the encountering the unexpected is often a joy that we seek out. And yet, wasn't COVID also about encountering the unexpected? I've had way too much of that. So how come that wasn't so zesty? There's a simple difference, which is that exploration is when you visit the unknown, and disruption is when the unknown visits you. And the difference is agency. Do you have control? Do you feel you have control? When you signed up to go hiking in New Guinea, you signed up for the unknown. And as futurists, we signed up for this wild ride of change called AI. We are looking forward to its unknowns because we have consciously chosen into that future, but 90% of the rest of the world has not. And so when we talk to them about it, our enthusiasm can be counterproductive precisely because it feels like being in the back seat of a car, being driven at 100 along the M1, assuming you can do 100 along the M1, by a teenager chugging a Red Bull who's leaning around to say, I have no idea where we're going, but this is fun, right? So that's the thing to take in mind, to bear in mind with these audiences is that our enthusiasm for, hey, we're going into this wonderful future, don't know what's in store, isn't that fantastic? It can be received precisely the wrong way. And we can inhabit what feel like different worlds. I have experienced this most in my sessions with my TEDx speaking coach, who's not a technologist of any stripe. I can't tell you how many times I would go in with some impassioned monologue along a theme that would be recognizable and enjoyable to all of us, and you go, oh yeah, I dig that, tell me more, I want more of that. And she would say, I have no idea what you just said, and I don't care. And in fact, even prior to her, some years even before that, I engaged Pat Johnson, who lives locally. He was a past international president of Toastmasters, so use everything for your advancement. And so I engaged her services for some of the very first talks I was doing about the existential risk of AI. And time after time, she would stop me after a few minutes going, nah, not getting it, don't care. And finally, I snapped and I said, Pat, I am talking about the end of the world. Everyone dies. How can they not care? And she said, because you haven't told them how they can do anything about it. And that's, again, getting back to agency. So in talking to our audiences, non-futurist, non-technologist audiences about this stuff, give them some agency. Where are the choices that they can make about how this affects them? How can they feel like this is something that they are choosing into, that they are going towards? It's not as simple. In the case of AI, is saying, well, this is a dual use technology, right? You can use, yes, that's true. But in a way that I don't know is true for anything else. For instance, there's some software called Icor from a company in Quebec called Menya Solutions. Can be used for defending a carrier battle group in the ocean. One of the slides from that, and I saw their representative speaking about that. Same system can be trained to do medical diagnosis. Now, what else is that dual use? Computers, yes, but we're talking about an extension of computers. We're actually talking about something with the flexibility of people, of like a person in a job fair, looking at two adjacent tables, choosing between a career as a medical researcher and join the Navy. Same brain can be used for both. So one of my favorite, more useful quotes about this comes from Andrew Ng, who says artificial intelligence is the new electricity. If we go back to the beginning of the electrical era, you have Alessandro Volta demonstrating electricity to Napoleon by electrocuting a frog, well, a dead one anyway. And apparently this didn't have any value to Napoleon, not aware of him employing electricity in any form at that point. But maybe it was a distraction because Napoleon had occupied Volta's city for 4 years at that point. So maybe he was hoping to curry favor. Don't know. Now, there's a lot to unpack from this statement. It carries a lot of mileage. And I had been reading a lot of Buckminster Fuller. And, you know, if you've read any Buckminster Fuller, he loves to make up new words. And I'm looking at that and I'm going, oh, I'm futurist. I really ought to do that. So at the expense of a number of brain cells, I did the process of describing what Ng is talking about here, condensing it to one word, which is dinocognisis, the process of applying power to thought. And yes, I know now that that is 2 Greek roots and 1 Latin. One, in my defense, I did not take either of those subjects in school, which was Southend High School for boys, incidentally. But I find it a useful way of condensing what Ng was talking about down to one word. It's not just about the fact that we're using electricity, obviously, to power machines that take the process of thought, but it is what the process of what is the process of powering, in other words, accelerating and amplifying the process of thinking itself, because that's what artificial intelligence is doing, is amplifying and speeding up greatly the way we think, taking it along directions that we could do, only faster, and then taking it in directions that we don't yet know how to do. And well, more on that later, but that's the central premise of why AI is different. What makes it so much more different from everything that we've done before is that it is taking on perhaps the last bastion of human exceptionalism, which is thinking. And now the scope of artificial intelligence demonstrates this. It overlaps it into every human field of expression. We can talk about a couple of these at least. Learning, obviously ethics and creativity, wellness, socialization, how we interact with each other. And you're already thinking about how it does that. Those are obvious. It overlaps into every human sector of activity. And you can think about examples of these. Religion, you might be thinking, wait a minute, not so sure about that. Yes, we can do that too. And just to give an example of that from the book, people often would ask me at some point in talking about AI, aren't we playing God, trying to create things that can do this? And my stock response is no, we're talking about making things that can help us with creating a better future through improving the way we think. But to revisit the question of sentience, to feel, we will not trust AI. People out there guaranteed will not trust AI until they believe and have demonstrated to them that it can feel their pain, that it shares, that it has empathy, for which you need to be able to feel. And therefore, we have to create AI that is sentient, that can feel. And not only that, for it to relate to these people, we have to create AI that is capable of feeling pain. And then we have to ensure that it does. In other words, we'll be in the position of making something that is able to feel pain and ensuring that it experiences pain. Now, I think that's about as close as you can get to the definition of playing God. So somewhere that is in our future, and something again worth raising to expand people's minds. Many of these things need the right context, or obviously certain audiences, certain people can veer off into either massive fright or outrage. And in the other direction, of course, AI for many years had expectations on it that were not met. And we could go back to 1981, Japanese fifth generation computing project. Now, these were people that were walking on water at the time. They were practically infallible. So when they said, we are going to take 4 years to create a computer that can do these things, translate from English to Japanese and back, answer questions in spoken language about general knowledge, understand human speech, find pictures from library of, they thought 100,000 images would be a lot, and solve sophisticated problems, and as a secondary goal, play Go at an expert level. They didn't, obviously, even though they gave themselves about 4 years. And you know, if you go back even further, 1956, the original founding fathers of AI said that they were going to do more or less that summer. So more cautious here. This didn't happen. And yet I'm sure you're noticing now that we have actually done that. Deep learning means that all of these things have been done. We all know about the Go. We all know about the translation. You can go from English to Japanese and back, Google Translate. That system alone is near flawless. And of course, you can find the edges where it doesn't, but it is fit for purpose for most purposes. And so that would unquestionably have been recognized by the fifth generation project as meeting their goals. So we've got there. AI has now realized the goals from there. And in typical fashion with AI, as soon as it does something that we were saying, this will be artificial intelligence, we say, no, that's not really artificial intelligence. That's something else. We like to move the goalposts. But to a non-technology audience, the important thing to realize about this is Arthur C. Clarke's admonition. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic comes in here, because to them, doing that translation, doing the things that we've seen from Transformers, doing a text chat, doing most of the things of AI at the moment is advanced enough technology that to them it is magic. Now, the thing to take from this is not that they see this as magic, because we usually stop there. It's that they then extend that to everything else that they can imagine is magical. So that when they see an AI doing something they don't understand, like being a Go champion or making up a story, they imagine that means it is now capable of doing everything else that they can't imagine how it can be done, like critiquing a movie, or teaching a class on Heidegger, being the chair of the London Futurists. They assume that those things are equally within reach because they all look impossible, and that some of them have now been done. And so it's very important when talking with these audiences to be able to draw those distinctions. And the direction I go in is saying it might look like AI doesn't is thinking the same way as us, but it's not. And let's look at some demonstrations of that. One of them, for instance, it's easiest to demonstrate those in images. Now, here we have a American stop sign, North American stop sign that looks like it's just got some graffiti on it. If you didn't stop for one of these, it is not going to stop you from getting a ticket. The defense that, well, the sign was defaced is not going to hold up for a second. And yet, to AI, it thinks this is a yield sign. I mean, it's not random graffiti, of course. It's carefully placed there by researchers who ran the algorithm backwards, in essence, to find out where are the key points that it's looking for. And it turns out that those are actually rather few. So despite the fact that it is capable of recognizing a stop sign in a wide variety of challenging environments, different amounts of being obscured and so forth, it's brittle in ways that can be exploited like this. And here's one that it thinks is a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit sign, just by putting these little pieces of black and white tape on it in strategic places. Image recognition is one of the places where it's easiest to demonstrate that AI is just not thinking the way that we do. And they're also very useful, or they're very photogenic examples for audiences. And so we can extend this into some other things that United Kingdom police have got AI that's looking for online porn. It gets confused by sand dunes. Now, okay, we can forgive this. You can look at that and go, yeah, I get what you were thinking. I can kind of see that. It's not getting me excited, but I see where you're coming from. But it doesn't stop there. This is Tom White, who was on my podcast. He's standing in front of a picture that is pictures that are not safe for work. Here's a close-up of one of them. It's called Mustard Dream, and it is rated 92.4% likely to be explicit nudity by the Amazon engine, the thing that keeps us safe from porn. I have just exposed all of us here to some degree of risk from algorithms. If the recording of this is subjected to any kind of automated scanning, it will probably flag this. Actually, I'm not certain how probable it is, but it's certainly possible that it will flag this talk as X-rated. One of the interesting things about his work is that you'd think that the brittleness would be confined to one algorithm. Actually, all of them that rate this do the same thing. It is rated not safe for work by Yahoo and TikTok, all of the ones he's tried. come up with the same thing. Now, I'm not going to get in trouble from any person looking at this. But as he says, well, what if there's some sort of automated scanning, say at a border checkpoint? Do you have something in your possession digitally that is prohibited to cross the border here or inside this country? And what if there's an age filter on this as well? And well, what age might, and if it's falls the wrong side of that? These are the sort of boundaries that we are going to be exploring with this. Now, it demonstrates that AI does not think the same way that we do. And here's another series of images that help point out the difference here. So this calls for some participation. I ask audiences to call out as quickly as they can the type of animal that they see in these pictures. You can do this if you want. Doesn't matter that I can't hear you, works anyway. So here we go. Now, even though I couldn't hear you, based on past experience, I'm going to wager that it took you a fraction of a second longer to identify this, unless you have taken trips to Morocco and seen these goats there because they this is where that was taken, and they allegedly climb the branches of the argan tree to get at the fruit there. There is some dispute over this, with some people saying that they've actually been put up there by locals so that they can charge tourists for pictures. But if you're not used to seeing goats in a tree, you do what we call the double take. It's like, bird? Wait, no, hold on. And you engage a conscious part of your brain. What you were using in the other ones was what Daniel Kahneman calls system one thinking. There's pattern recognition. It's intuitive. It's and the irony in this is that kind of recognition, the thing that lets you see a cat and go cat before you think consciously cat, is that reflexive pattern matching, which we is fiendishly difficult to encode algorithmically. Like, you cannot write down how you recognize faces. No one can. You can do it very well, but you can't describe that process in computer language. And yet, you would think that that would mean the old adage that many people have taken on board is a computer can only do what it's been programmed to do. So therefore, it shouldn't be able to recognize faces if we can't program a computer to recognize faces, and yet we can. Not by telling it how to do that, because we still don't know, but by training it. And so that's what accounts for a lot of the progress of AI recently in doing, in success, everything from image recognition to playing chess and Go, is it's pattern matching. It is a AI today, the deep learning especially is a pattern matching algorithm, is a pattern generating algorithm. But when you give it something that's outside of its training set, the problem is that almost certainly it was never trained to say, I don't know. It was given a set of examples. This maps to this, this maps to this. And eventually, if you have enough pictures of different types of dogs, it learned how to recognize those breeds of dogs. But it was never given some things that were not dogs. The infinite set of possibilities outside that set to try from. So most instances of AI do not know how to say, I don't know. They pick the closest thing, even when that is risibly far away. And so the results of training AI on, or presenting this image to AI, were that one of them thought it was birds, and Azure thought it was giraffes. Azure is notorious for identifying giraffes where there are no giraffes. And so we start to get the idea that AI superficially, in some ways, seems to be doing the same thing that we are, but it's not doing it the same way. And yet we are thrown to anthropomorphizing things that work this way. When we see a computer beat someone at the incredibly cerebral game of Go and be the world champion at that by a long way. Now we know that any human who's doing this has, at that level, has reached the pinnacle of human achievement. That their brain is special, that they have trained it to do something extraordinary. And so we again, magic, think of AI that way. And yet different kinds of games can expose weakness. So give it a video game that looks like this. Now, if I show you this, without any further clues, you know what the goal is, what to avoid, and the questions you need to ask about how to play this. What makes this character move and jump? That's it. But giving this to AI, it is extraordinarily difficult to get it to figure those things out, because there are just a bunch of pixels that change color over time. It doesn't, the rules of Go are phenomenally simple, which is one of the things that make it hard for us to play. But there are, and there are so few inputs that you could encode that game mathematically, but to us, this is simple. There's like 3 objects and an environment. But even the concept of there being objects here is something that AI looking at this has to figure out. And to us, it's a natural that there's gravity here, because we see things that in our world obey the law of gravity, and they are sitting on top of things that look like they're obeying the law of gravity. So we intuit that gravity is one of the rules of this game, and AI can't do that without a lot of training. So this is much harder for it to learn than Go. Counterintuitive, of course, to people. A 3-year-old could play this video game. And so we have to demonstrate to people constantly the differences that the AI is where AI falls short. And the area of creativity is one of the ones that embodies that the most. Here is one of the GPT-3 backed algorithms. It's called sudowright, doing something which I've recorded once for groups of coaches. So I said, let's play. So you want to write something about core competencies of a coach. So I type that out, and then I get lazy. So I go and copy a paragraph from the International Coaching Federation, paste it in, and then tell sudowright, fill in the rest for me. Sudowright wants to do fiction, so it generates this array of things to help me get unstuck as a creative writer on what might come next, and then I can pick a noun and say describe this according to different sensory modalities, and it will tell me what a coach looks like, sounds like, smells like, getting increasingly weird there, but not failing to get you unstuck as a creative writer. It's definitely going into all kinds of weird places. Well, and then I show something like this, where I give it the prompt, what should students in this class know about artificial intelligence? And the latest models of GPT-3 come out with this, including the bullet points. You know, I could just cut and paste it. That's pretty good. Now that and is this not demonstrating creative thinking? We have some experience that tells us better. It's very hard to avoid that conclusion when you look at something like this, which is called the next Rembrandt. ING in the Netherlands sponsored this, and threw gobs of money at researchers who were happy to feed every Rembrandt painting into an AI and then have it decided what the archetypal Rembrandt painting would be a male looking slightly to the right and head and shoulder shot. got it to generate this and then sent it off to an extremely expensive digital printer. And then this, of course, prompts all kinds of conversations about creativity, because you can have AI generating things that please us in the same way that are indistinguishable from the creative output of people like Mozart, which we find really offensive, because we accepted that art initially on the basis of it was the result of I call it divine communion between a human transcending normal reality and something beyond that. And to have an AI do something that we can't tell the difference is obviously offensive to a lot of people, but it prompts conversation to say, well, how should we think about this without devaluing artists, or without cheating ourselves out of art? And that would lead us into empathy. And here is a robot that explores the space of empathy. And there are plenty that do. This one is called Moxie. He's got this face that appears on his curved screen for a forehead. And I interviewed the CEO of this. Now, they take on a space that I would have said would be one of the last places we ought to or could let robots get into, working with troubled children, children with impaired social development. And I would have thought the liability alone would be crippling, but no, within the right context, this robot is very careful to set up the right context. It comes along and says, "Hi, I'm Moxie. I just arrived here. Can you help me learn about this world and humans?" And that narrows the context down to one that allow its responses to be, allow it to construct responses that continue to be useful and to provide emotional value and therapeutic value for the children. It's hard, again, to impress upon an audience that this is not something that's a stone's throw away from Terminator or Ex Machina. But the key differentiator is that it is operating within a very narrow context where it gets to set the expectations. And to teach me more about that, to go back to Eliza, the chatbot in the 60s. Oh, tell me more about your father. It didn't need that much for Weizenbaum's, the inventor's secretary, to tell him, "I want to have a private conversation with this. Can you leave the room, please?" She knew it was a machine, but it was still a useful conversation. Now, and part of the reason that we as humans wrap ourselves around the axle on this is what's called a modal completion. Visually, this can show up as something called the kinesia triangle, isn't one example of it. We see a white triangle in the middle. Now, whether it's there or not is debatable, but but you can't not see it. And in humans, all of these 7 things come together. You can be unconscious at times, but there's presumption that you're likely to wake up at some point and become conscious again. And so these all go together, which means that when we see an organism demonstrating any one of these things, we think that it's got the others. And so if we see an AI being intelligent, it is a reflex action to think that free will is somewhere there, that it has a survival instinct. I mean, that's, if you examine a lot of the conversations about the perils of AI, it's just a given in there that it has a survival instinct. Why? We evolved one because if you don't have a survival instinct, you don't get selected. And something like that will eventually apply to AI, but the evolutionary survival of the fittest takes a much different path when it comes to artificial intelligence. So this is something to explore and say things that have some of these not necessarily have the others. And as Paddy was saying earlier, can be something to be conscious but not sentient. Yes, either way, one or the other in both directions. Of course, we know that ethics is a huge question when it comes to AI, and we could go into so many dimensions of this, but one I want to take a little bit of time on, because it again points up this question of how we are different, is explainability. Now, some questions that we are going to get AI to solve and can solve very well, like, why did you deny or approve this loan claim? Why did you choose to hire or fire this person? Why did you decide this was or wasn't lung cancer? Clearly, those are questions where, firstly, AI can do a better job than humans. That can be trained to do that. Secondly, the stakes are high. And thirdly, there will be the need to provide an explanation. And any human making those decisions, we would expect an explanation from them that would satisfy us, or we would reverse the decision. But with AI, now we get into what do we mean by explanation? As an example, if we were asked a self-driving car, why did you turn left at that point? It might choose to say that my front wheels pivoted for 1800 milliseconds, or I reached the intersection, or I was following my navigation plan, or that was the optimal route to my destination, or you told me to. I mean, it's going back along several chains of logic there. But the one we wanted, you don't usually is behind the context of you don't usually go this way to the office. Oh, well, the usual route was blocked by an accident. This was what makes explanations very challenging, because in fields of human endeavor rely upon a large amount of context that is not generally supplied to an AI. There are some ingenious solutions to this in some fields at the expense of a huge amount of effort. But that is again an area where the message is this is going to provide some sort of speed bump to the adoption of these technologies, because while you can put things out there right now that can decide which students should or shouldn't be admitted to university, to use an example that's got some baggage behind it in Britain, we will require them to give explanations. Just getting into a few other areas here where we often get asked about this. Self-driving cars. Now, the trolley problem comes up ad nauseum on the podcast. And if in case any of you somehow have missed this, the trolley is running down the tracks towards where someone has tied 5 people to it, and you have the option of throwing a switch that will divert it to a track where there's one person. Do you do that or not? Now, it was posed by Philippa Foot in 1967 as this philosophical thought experiment to get at people's values and also torture them emotionally. There's a huge number of variations on this problem that have been actually encapsulated in a whole book called "Would You Kill the Fat Man?" And this has gotten an unreasonable amount of traction in the automated autonomous vehicles field, because people assume that we now have to program cars for situations like seeing 2 old ladies crossing the road and its only choice is to swerve and run over a child waiting for a bus, and that we're going to have to do those. Now, that is far less likely and less imminent than a real trolley problem that is guaranteed to happen much sooner with self-driving cars. and that is that it will reach a point where it is, on average, safer than humans. Because there are places, again, this gets at the difference between how it thinks and we think. Driving down an American freeway, like in the Midwest, there are roads where you can see the earth bend. You will encounter nothing but tumbleweeds to the horizon. And of course, we get bored. It's like, this is easy, and our brain wants to take a break, go do something else. That's when we're dangerous. That's easy, of course, for an AI. So there is this range of situations where AI cars will be safer than us. And at some point, it will become possible to say, in these environments, the cars are, on average, 5 times safer than humans. At which point we have a real trolley problem, because we will be making the choice at that point, if we deploy the autonomous vehicles, in fact, if we mandate them, which would make sense, we are throwing the switch, because there will then be situations where, not thinking like humans, they will inevitably cause a fatal accident that a human wouldn't have. And this will be catnip for lawyers. How will that be resolved? A court case, for sure, or a settlement out of court, more likely. If the insurance company has done its sums properly, they'll say, yep, we expected this, it's still worth paying it off. And well, I've been having so much fun, I actually have to go faster, because the huge question that people have is, am I going to lose my job? And the prototypical study for this came out in 2013 by Carl Fry and Michael Osborne from Oxford University, the Oxford Martin Program for the Future of Employment, which concluded that an average of 47% of jobs were at risk of being automated. There is a neat visualization of this from Quartz online, where you can hover over circles that they combined with the Bureau of Labor Studies information of how many people were in those fields and how much they got paid. Well, that study I have issues with, because he did a huge amount of work examining hundreds of fields, and concluded different degrees of the horizontal axis is how likely is the field to become automated, which is their language, and I still don't quite get it, because I think it should be talking about what proportion of the job could be automated. They looked at, to what extent do those people perform repetitive, cognitive, or manual labor, which means that retail point of sale clerks are far up to the right, because they do a lot of things like, in a clothing store, folding a t-shirt the customer didn't buy, putting it back on the shelf over and over and over again. But that is a phenomenally hard thing for an AI to do. There's a robot called the Lawn Droid that can do it. It takes about 5 minutes and costs $16,000, and it's big. It doesn't even move. You have to feed the t-shirt into it. I don't know what the use case for that is. And so simply having repetitive tasks is not result in the likelihood of the job actually being automated soon. And so I show people these intersection of circles here. Is what you do something that could be automated? Would it be cost effective if it were automated? And is it something we actually want to automate? Or would we rather say, no, actually, I like doing that. I don't want a machine to do that. And if something lies at the intersection of all those things, then it's a candidate for being automated, and you should probably make your job depend upon doing something else. I'm going to go off another topic here, which is the sensationalism and of AI. Of course, we know there's so much of this, and the response of technologists to that is often like a meme like this, which any of you who've done AI will recognize what the right hand pane is talking about, and saying, look, the we are so far away from this happening, and of course the media, every time there's any question about the direction of AI, wants to run this image next to it. And I'm actually going to say that AI has already caused the end of the world. And this is the point where I pray that the network doesn't go down, because I need to tell you why I say that. And this is one of the more pessimistic things, depressing things one can say about AI. But here's the line of reasoning: that AI has, through its use in algorithms in social media, recommender algorithms, inadvertently radicalized people. The Wall Street Journal did a study of this and actually graphed it. This is not a picture from the James Webb Space Telescope. This is actually a visualization of the subject space that viewers of TikTok videos, which they documented using hundreds of pseudo users, bots in other words, with selected personality types, demonstrated that if a bot came in with a tendency towards sadness, it ended up being shown videos about suicide. If they came in with interested in running, it would end up in ultramarathon. If they came in interested in health, it would be shown veganism. If they came in with any tendency towards conspiracy-minded thinking, they would end up with QAnon. And I'm going to assert that that has had already impact on certain national votes that we're familiar with that have changed the direction of our planet. And for example, do you think that the United States would have pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords if Hillary Clinton had been president? Which, and then here's the chain of logic, according to climate scientists I'm listening to, we may have already passed the tipping point with respect to that. So you see, it's not hard to connect the dots and say AI actually already accidentally, not consciously, of course, may have caused the end of the world for certain values of end of the world. Is that real? Well, what were you doing last Tuesday? Trying to stay cool, right? Of course, this is real. And a lot of our futurism business is involved in showing exponential curves, right? So we show the chart of computer progress takes place along a steep exponential curve. We know that one, it's Moore's law. And other things in human endeavor have certain exponential curves, like manufacturing or even medicine, just slower ones. This is not to scale, of course. Environmental science, perhaps, and slower cognitive science. We learn, and down at the bottom, perhaps even being generous in giving a bent to that, we have human nature. And I'm going to assert that the climate change is the result of the difference between these two curves, how fast we learn to do manufacturing and industry, and how fast we evolved our environmental science. That problem has gotten us where we are. And then I ask people to consider, well, what might the difference between these curves represent? Between the computer and human nature, because that's what we're up against with AI. That doesn't necessarily represent problem, that represents opportunity as well. But of course, most people think problem, that's how we're wired. And human nature has not perhaps changed that. Well, you know, we've come some way since this, although maybe not as far as we like to think. And then, and part of the problem with this results from the fact that we are cognitively very bad at dealing with big numbers and small probabilities. because it's actually true that your chance of being killed in a plane accident is equal to your chance of being killed by an asteroid, which is not intuitive to most people, but here is the math. The asteroids that would wipe out the planet arrive about once every 50 million years, but one that did would kill, rounded up to 10 billion people. Well, on average, that is 200 people a year, which is the same number that die in commercial aviation accidents, more or less. And so we're not used to thinking of those risks as being equivalent, but unless you're an underwriter, then you can see the logic behind it. But making that kind of calculation is not come easy to us. We look at numbers like this, and visually, 1 million looks about twice the size of a 1,000. A billion and a million differ only by one letter. It's very easy to get it wrong in speech. And 10 to the 8th, 10 to the 3rd differ by 10,000, but you have to kind of squint often to even see that difference. We don't intuit those things. And as a result, one of the principles that's been enunciated by Bill Gates and Roy Amara says, we overestimate what can be achieved in the short term, like 2 years, but underestimate in the long term, like 10 years. And that's a result of us being wired for linear thinking in an exponential world. So we make a projection that looks 2 years out like, yeah, and when we don't catch up with it, but 10 years out, we're behind and getting further and further behind. And so let's look at some of the ways in which this is how we relate AI to people. I compare it to the parable of the 6 blind men and the elephant, except AI is a really big elephant. We got more than 6 aspects to deal with here. And in fact, the number of things that we can encompass at once is pretty small in our brain. George Miller, Princeton, Harvard psychologist, said 7 plus or minus 2 things. You've heard this saying. There are things we know, great, and we know there are things we know we don't know. And then beyond that, you know that there are things we don't know that we don't know. And that those occupy some huge space, but that's one of the things that causes disruption and surprise. I'm going to start with AI especially. There is a field beyond that of, again, unknown size, which is what is unknowable, that even if it was staring us in the face, it would be impossible for us to comprehend it, because it would require more than that 7 plus or minus 2 things that we can essentially hold in our brain at once. But that the possibility is that AI could do that for us. I will give an example of what I think AI could do in a shorter term for us, in the way that we interact with computers. That there have been 3 dominant paradigms that I call the farm, the supermarket, and the restaurant in our interactions with computers. And the farm is characterized by this, back in the day, you had to memorize a manual like this if you wanted to talk to the computer, or it just wouldn't give you the time of day. But now we're used to something like this, where you have a user-friendly menus. Even something as difficult as editing video, it's expected to that it will be practically intuitive. But it's still one interface. And the only changes are made for if you pick the language. Well, the potential for changing user interfaces, and I don't have a diagram for this because it hasn't happened yet, so that it is customized to us, is that we could understand the user to a whole new level, not just the language they speak, but are they interested in detail? Are they what do they want to know at this point? What are the best ways of explaining it to them? A whole lot of cognitive and psychometric science waiting to be used to allow an AI user interface to provide that variable interface, customized. So this is like my prod for computer AI engineers and user interface engineers, get together and make this happen, because it would be a whole lot more useful. And then the question is, well, when is this going to happen? When are we going to get the singularity, right? And I think one of the possibilities for actually seeing that, well, actually lies in brain-computer interfaces as the interface between us and AI. And sorry, let me backtrack the reason for that. What does this represent for us with AI? And this is, I think, the most optimistic view of the future is AI collaborating with us via this kind of interface. Now, at the moment, it is, of course, very primitive. We can implant an array of electrodes in the visual cortex that's shaped like an rectilinear array, and stimulate them and cause the user to see a letter. That's about the extent of the resolution of it. And yet, the visual cortex does not have neurons there that map to these positions in the visual field that coincidentally are arrayed in exactly in the position of these electrodes. So how does it work? The brain adapts to the AI, to the electrode array, not the other way around. The brain figures out how to map these to the right things. It's our neuroplasticity skill. So what if that can go further? What if that can go further to the degree of interpreting more abstract, complex thoughts and communications, that we could manage telepathy? And this talk would have been over in the first 5 minutes instead of being in danger of running over. And that AI becomes the pattern matching and making engine that reconciles those things. And when might that happen? We don't know when the singularity is going to happen. But if we look at the what's called the diffusion of innovation curve, how fast do people adopt technologies, and it's this cumulative normal distribution. People have actually done that for a variety of technologies, ranging from the car over to the smartphone and a bunch of things in between. What we can see is that those curves are getting steeper. And some math that would be not impossible, but would take me far too long, would be to actually plot the change of those accelerations on a chart and see when does that thing turn vertical enough to call it the singularity, and possibly predict. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it says that you have to have your physiological survival assured before you can be interested in or have the energy to take care of any of these higher level things like self-esteem, emotional growth, and so forth. And this is very visible in things like corporate environments where the training budget is the first thing to get cut because they need that money for keeping the plant open. But I assert that artificial intelligence impact on the job market inverts this, and that it requires businesses, the principles of those businesses, to actually know what they are doing and why they are doing it, and to communicate that to the workforce through empathetic and enlightened channels in order for the business to survive, because otherwise the dynamics of automation will be such that they threaten many of those businesses. And this is a hugely good thing, because it means that we'll have people learning how to, and being motivated to learn how to treat the people working for them like humans. We talked during the pandemic a lot about K-shaped recoveries, because there would be some businesses that did very well and others that did not. If you were Amazon, you did great. People ordering a ton of stuff. If you were Hilton, you did not. You had to close your hotels and so forth. And so we had the idea that disruption can cause this bifurcation of outcomes. Well, in the future for AI, we have this, again, this amazingly symmetrical bifurcation as we move into the future of potential outcomes that negative and positive. Automation of jobs, but automation of jobs we don't want to do and don't like to do and are not good for us, all the way up to existential threat versus AI promising immortality. As futurists, you know those tropes. And what makes the difference between those? The people that we're talking to. Why is there such a big difference? Because we don't know which of these paths we're going to take. And this is where I give the audience the agency. The reason that we can't predict this is because it depends upon the actions of the humans involved, and that's you. That's all of you. It's not just the people like ourselves, the futurists. This is where I blame the futurists. The futurists in the turtleneck sweaters on talk shows. It's not just the leaders of the company. This is where you have to find your agency to move the needle on our future. And so that is visiting some of those things. I've left less time than I wanted to for Q&A, but we'll get into that right now. I'll go through the ones in the chat. My podcast URL is at the bottom, and next Monday is an episode that is different from the other ones I've done. It is me interpreting AI today through the lens of Monty Python. So for good or worse, that may be entertaining.
No one expects the Monty Python point of view.
Exactly. Well. So
we'll be moving from elephants to parrots, perhaps.
Or penguins.
Or penguins. Thank you so much, Peter. You've given us a great deal to think about. As you pointed out, AI is a really big elephant, and it's clear that there are so many angles we could look at. So I'm going to ask the audience to help me by voting for some of the questions as to which ones we should try to get to first. Let me take a question by Rachel Tillotson, who's asking about one of the frightening aspects, perhaps. I mean, you did say, Peter, that one of the risks when we excitedly talk about the future is we unintentionally end up frightening the audience. So Rachel's asking about the psychological and emotional impact of AI on people. And they worry that they won't be able to keep up emotionally or psychologically with the rate of change. What can you say to possibly reassure people that they won't be left behind? Or are there some other words of positivity you can inject here?
Well, this definitely gets to the need to empower them in their local environment, because we have jobs where the people running those are making choices about using AI and other technology to accelerate the change, trying to drive the hamster wheel faster towards a goal that is never going to become within reach. And so we have to refocus that conversation, because otherwise it is only going to get worse. And acknowledge we're not only not going to be able to get it all done, there is no magic bullet of technology that's somehow going to leave us with eviscerating the competition and living lives of leisure, but that we have to be okay with that, and that we have to look at using AI, especially, to provide the comfort with that rate of change. So I think the audience is right to be concerned about this, because this is definitely heading in the wrong direction. And yet it is one of those things where the differences matter most and can be affected most at the most local levels, at the workplace. And understanding if you can curate your own workplace to be effective in that respect, to do a better job in that respect, to establish the values that that they will operate by, that incorporate what you want to see there, then those people are now in a position to understand that people all around us in different places are going through the same thing, and how can we help them?
So you want to see more examples when that pyramid is turned upside down,
Yes.
when what's talked about at work is less of what was traditionally the bottom layers and more of what was traditionally the top layers. Are there examples from your podcasting history of when people were able to point to when this had happened?
There are lots of examples of companies that have done this, adopting models like holacracy, where there is no discernible leader. I think Zappos is one of those. Not that they've been on the podcast, but that I've heard of them doing that. Brief answer.
Yeah, that's fair. But I think we need to be able to point out, not just, hey, let's change, but these guys over there, they're on the way to doing so, and let's learn from them. The top question you already touched on in your talk, but I think it's worth going back to, by Patty O'Callaghan, because it's also tied up with actualization, and we need to understand more fully what is consciousness, what is sentience. So do you have views on whether anytime soon we're going to understand more clearly these different aspects of enlightenment or higher states of being?
I would bet long odds against it. No one's shown to me any evidence that we've got a foot on that ladder yet of understanding what sentience is. But in terms of the I know it when I see it dynamic, AI we can have AI that demonstrates or provides empathy already. Mind you, so does a teddy bear. And this is just exercising some different modalities like speech that, again, throw us to the idea of anthropomorphizing it. But sentience isn't necessarily intelligence, it's ability to feel. If you pinch it and it says, ow, that's some value of sentience. And so, but that provides this potential for useful interactions. There's something called Woebot, which is a therapeutic bot. Now, ELIZA was arguably therapeutic, but no one actually tried to measure it. Woebot is demonstrably, provably therapeutic, and in interactions as a psychotherapist with people. Again, there's some narrowing of the context that I don't have time to go into, but WOEBOT.
I think there is scope here for two different communities to learn more from each other. I've been struck several times by talking to people who are very knowledgeable about AI and intelligence and the control problem, but they don't seem to be aware that I think some progress is being made by some researchers into understanding consciousness. So there's work by Stanislas Dehaene, there's a French neurologist, there's work by Mark Solms, who is South African, there's Anil Seth, based in the UK, and in the various ways they're identifying what's happening in parts of the brain when we are not conscious, but there's intelligence, but what's happening when in parts of the brain when, conversely, we are sentient, but maybe not so intelligent. So there seems to be some ways forwards there. There's people like Susan Schneider, who also featured in London Futurists a year or two back, on her attempts to come up with questions that would elicit whether an AI was truly sentient or was just faking it. And then there's, of course, David Chalmers, who has written very thoughtfully on many of these points. So I don't think we're at a solution yet, but I disagree with people like Stuart Russell, who normally I do agree with, but when Stuart Russell says we've made no progress at all in understanding consciousness, I think these 5 people I think I've pointed to are on the way of clarifying it. So I look forward to a better discussion there. And if we don't have that better discussion, we're going to have more of what you pointed out in the beginning, which is a very poor press coverage of this story by Blake Lemoine, which caused most of us to want to tear out our hair. Of course, this AI is not conscious. How can people so readily jump to that conclusion? Have you looked at any of these people?
Yes, I have to say my level of understanding of what they're offering at the moment is not up to where I would like it to be. A work in progress. I would like to address Terry's point here about the feeling pain, where he says that perhaps the worst thing you can do is feel their pain. I want to draw the distinction here between, because I've worked with so many professionals in the field of of empathy here, the ability to empathize with someone's pain of having had that experience of being sensitive to that pain, but not being controlled by that is one of the differences. So that's the ability to rise above the influence of the pain is the distinction.
I was a bit unsure about that part of your talk myself, because I remember some research that implies that when military people come back with lots of pent-up emotions and pent-up feelings about their time in conflict zones, many of them found it easier to unburden themselves talking to AIs rather than to humans, because they felt that the AIs would understand to a certain extent, but they wouldn't judge in a way that they presumed humans would judge. So there may be roles for these AI would pick up also micro expressions on the face, which some people can do, but I don't seem to pick them up, but others can pick them up and say, there's something interesting going on here.
Mm-hmm. Right, I mentioned some of that in the book too. So there are places where actually AI has an advantage, some contexts where AI does have an advantage over humans for the reasons that you state. The examples with the military personnel was that their desire to appear strong, macho, if you will, overrode got in the way of them expressing themselves more clearly and transparently. In a therapeutic context, with enough time, they would first get past that, and then there would be a much larger wellspring of possibility on the other side of that. But yes, there's that niche that AI can exploit on the near side of that.
The topmost question is from an anonymous attendee who is worried that AIs are going to take on harmful viewpoints from the environment, because there are harmful viewpoints spread throughout the environment. So the example of Microsoft's Tay chatbot, that's a rather extreme one, but there are other more subtle ways in which software picks up some biases in humans and then magnifies them. Is that something we have to live with, or might explainable AI highlight what's going on there?
This is a really difficult thing at the moment, and is a very hot topic, because what needs to be done is demonstrably different from what has been done. So training AI on what has been done gives it the wrong background. If you train an AI to predict the next president of the United States based on the ones that have happened in the past, it will not predict a woman. And that's just sort of more innocuous example. So if you have AIs like Amazon used resume screening ones, and it downvoted ones that were or could be inferred to be from women, and that clearly is the difference between history and aspiration, and so we have to explicitly build aspiration in to the training data, because the problem is that humans, you can detect the bias with some if they're consciously biased, then a psychological professional can unearth that. But if an AI has bias in it somewhere, your only mechanism for unearthing that is statistics.
Let's take a question by Didier Cornell, who is worried about what he sees as lack of progress in health as a result of applying AI. So he's worried that as well as the categories you listed, known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, there are the falsely knowns. There are things that we tend to believe is true but aren't true and get in the way. So his worry is that AI had lots of promise for improving health, but hasn't actually done much yet. And so I don't know if you've any observation as to whether you think AI actually has helped health in a significant way yet, whether AI, a good enough AI might suddenly say, hey, you guys, you all assume this, but frankly, you're all wrong. And you should look at it like this instead.
It's, yes. Perhaps Didier was thinking of what happened with IBM Watson, which did not meet the hopes by a long way. There's the potential for it turning out well. Like with unsupervised learning, we ask AI to tell us things we don't already know about the data. And that was able, for instance, to, when fed metadata about retinal images, to discover that you could actually predict someone's gender from their retinal pattern, what it looks like at the back of their eyeball, which we weren't able to do before that. And even after it told us how it was able to do it, it still, humans still can't do that. And now that's, on the face of it, not terribly useful except in forensics, but it demonstrates the principle. And I agree that there's a lot of medicine that is frankly superstitious, and that relies too much on this elevating the physician or the specialist into some godlike position, because what they're doing has no explicability, and yet when we ask for a second opinion, somehow it's different. So I agree that I would like to see this. I don't know why that would mean that AGI, artificial general intelligence, well, I can imagine why, you could see why AGI could be very dangerous, but again, it's occupying both sides of that split. It could equally well be helping us understand things about ourselves. Lots of AI researchers say the more I learn about AI, the more I learn about myself. It causes this introspection and reflection on the human condition that is very valuable.
Perhaps I'd press you briefly on the AGI question. Are you slightly more confident that AGI is going to lead us in a great direction, or are you slightly more pessimistic it's going to lead us to hate each other more with the kinds of things you spoke about, the radicalization, the poisoning of thinking? Where does your probabilities lie? Is it 50-50? Is it 90-10? Or is it just too not possible to say?
Whenever anyone asks me the odds for some kind of outcome like that, that's on the existential scale, I refuse to answer. I don't consider it useful to give my personal odds. I would rather people, no matter what the odds are, do everything they can to make the outcome come out good, because it wouldn't make any difference whether those odds were 99-1 for or against. That's still what they should do.
We started a bit late because of some problems with the chat. So maybe if I can just ask one more question from the chat, and then we'll wind up. Because I think this leads in very nicely to what we've just been talking about, follows on nicely from what we're talking about. A question by PNJ, who says that maybe the bigger subject isn't just AI, it's agency. He asks, is there a case for presenting AI systems as being part of a continuum of other systems about which we humans feel we don't have enough agency? So there are big legal frameworks, there's corporate behavior, there's the suboptimal democratic systems, which are causing many of us to tear out our hair on both sides of the Atlantic. And in all cases, they would benefit if people had more agency. So do you have views on that?
I love this question because I need to think more about it. It suggests things like a participatory democracy, which we now have the technology to make work on much bigger scales than have been previously attempted. And it certainly reminds me that at the moment, the capital return on investment, the dividend from on investment in high technology, flows to the people that own, well, in general, had that capital to begin with, don't need it. And when we predict a future, when we predict a utopian future, we predict that for everyone. No one says, oh, I'm envisaging a utopian future. Things are wonderful for me, sucks for everyone else. But no, we predict a future that's fair, and where no one is left out. And yet the systems of government and capital that we have at the moment are driving greater separations. And so I would certainly like to see more of what PN is proposing here, where we grant people more agency. There is, in the same way that the internet has granted that potential, at the same time, in other ways it's taken it away. I think AI can do the most. And again, it comes back to, don't sit on the sidelines with this stuff. Don't assume it belongs to other people, the thought leaders, the self-proclaimed futurists. Oh, that's us. Never mind. All right, we are already on the hook for delivering the positive outcome.
Don't sit on the sidelines. I think that's a great summary. Is there any final thing you'd like to say before we switch off the recording, take a 8 or 9 minute break, and then continue, at least in some of us, in a more informal setting? What would you like to highlight? Things you rushed past, which maybe you want to say a little bit more about?
I rushed past a ton of stuff. That's why this book is so fat. I love talking to with this group because you asked wonderful questions. I know what I'm saying lands with you, and I look forward to doing it again.
And the book's available, paperback, ebook? Paperback,
Kindle, and soon to be audiobook.
Soon to be audio too, from all good bookshops.
And a hardcover.
And a hardcover. Well, that's serious stuff then. So thank you so much, Peter. You've given us a great deal to think about. We couldn't dive into the discussion at all points, but maybe we can revisit some of them shortly. So I'll say thanks for now.